Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva is back in power in Brazil. He's promised to unite the country and undo his predecessor's policies. But in a deeply divided nation, what can Lula deliver? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. As the saying goes, the third time's the charm for newly sworn-in Brazilian President Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva, commonly known as Lula. It's a chance to take his nation in a new direction. He has inherited a bitterly divided country with a bleak economic outlook and an Amazon rainforest suffering from decisions of his predecessor, Jair Bolsonaro, who allowed extensive deforestation. Bolsonaro skipped the handover ceremony and is now in the United States. So is this a new dawn for Brazil? And what challenges remain for its new leader? We'll put that to our guest. First, this report from our Latin America editor, Lucia Newman in Brasilia.
Newly sworn-in President Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva walked up the ramp of the presidential palace, flanked by members of Brazil's diverse society, including an indigenous leader, a black woman, a disabled man, a child, and a rubbish collector. It was a symbolic gesture. They shared the task of bestowing Lula the presidential sash, in lieu of outgoing President Jair Bolsonaro, who refused to recognize his successor.
We will use the weapons that our adversaries fear the most, the truth that prevails over lies, hope that conquers fear, and love that defeats hatred.
Thousands of supporters from all over Brazil had come to witness the return of the man they call the people's president. Firemen doused them with water to help overcome heat and exhaustion. Many, like Tatiana and Adriana, had arrived before dawn.
We've been waiting for 4 years for democracy, for the Brazilian people to eat and have jobs.
Lula's political comeback is nothing short of extraordinary. In 2018, he was sentenced to a nearly 13-year prison term for corruption, although he was later released after his sentence was overturned. 8 kilometers from the palace, fierce opponents camped near a military barracks, refusing to recognize their left-wing president. They vow to continue resisting Lula, who won by a very small margin in a bitterly fought election. But his supporters are overjoyed. Lula himself was overcome with emotion when he spoke of ending hunger among the poor.
Lines of people at the doors of butcher shops looking for bones to alleviate hunger, while at the same time others wait to buy imported cars and private jets. Such a social chasm is an obstacle to the building of a truly just, democratic society.
Lula is promising to reinstate most of the social programs that made him so popular during his first 2 terms. He has awoken tremendously high expectations amongst Brazilians, and that's always dangerous because there are expectations that he may not be able to meet.
Lula's powerful opponents, led by former President Bolsonaro, are determined to thwart his government at every turn, leaving the new president little time to celebrate. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera, Brasilia.
So here's Lula da Silva, and how did he make such a comeback? Well, he'd already served 2 terms as president from 2003 until 2010, after which he faced a number of legal challenges. In 2016, he was questioned in a multi-country anti-corruption investigation that led to the conviction of several members of his Workers' Party. It was led by a former judge who was an ally of Lula's rival, Jair Bolsonaro. Lula was found guilty of corruption and sentenced to 12 years in prison in 2017. He maintained his innocence as he was imprisoned in 2018. But Lula was freed a year later after Brazil's Supreme Court ruled the judge in his case was not impartial and overstepped his jurisdiction. Let's introduce our guests. Now in Sao Paulo, Guilherme Casaroes, professor of political science at Fundacao Getulio Vargas University. In Rabat, Nizar Messari, professor of international relations at Akhawayn University. In London, Vinicius de Carvalho, reader in Brazilian and Latin American studies at King's College London. He's also editor of the Anthem Brazilian Studies series. Welcome to the program. Guilherme, many thought that the inauguration was going to be a moment of unity, but at the same time we saw Lula da Silva very critical, denouncing the legacy of his predecessor, Bolsonaro.
Well, I think that we have to separate words and deeds. Lula has to reach out to his supporters, to his core supporters, who happen to be left-leaning, progressive. So I think that the inauguration speech makes sense in this logic of reaching out to his own political base, his constituents. But at the same time, we see that the composition of Lula's cabinet is very diverse. The Workers' Party doesn't have not as many ministries it used to have during Lula's first two tenures in office. So I think that we will have a much more moderate administration than the ones that we had in the early 2000s. So the rhetoric is left-leaning, but the deeds will be a little bit more to the center.
Nizar, a stunning political comeback, isn't it? But do you think that Lula da Silva should reinvent himself this time to be able to reach out to all the Brazilians?
He had to reinvent himself. He reintroduced himself to Brazilians as someone who is making a stand for democracy. And he managed over the last few months to build a coalition with someone who ran in previous elections against him, so which is Mr. Alckmin. So he managed to build a very wide coalition. He managed to get the support of very important figures from his former opposition, the party called PSDB, already in the first round of the elections, and in the second round he managed even more, reached out to more supporters of other political parties. So he managed really to build this coalition, which is in a sense reinventing himself. But that, and this is not the Lula we knew between 2002 and 2010.
Okay, Vinicius, when Lula left in 2010, he had an approval rating above 80%. He was one of the most popular presidents in modern history of Brazil. But then he served 580 days in prison on corruption charges. You have opponents saying that how come we are going to have to deal with someone who has to spend his time in jail, not be our president? Do you think this is going to be a big challenge for him?
It will be a big challenge, no doubt about that. But it's a quite epic, I would say, trajectory of Lula from his first election until what we have today. Lula will have so many challenges at this moment, and one of them is exactly to harmonize the country again. We should remember that he was elected with a very, very small majority over Bolsonaro. There is a quite huge part of Brazilian population that don't support Lula. Some of them not even support Bolsonaro, but didn't want Lula as well as president. And all this population that Lula promised in his speech, of inauguration speech yesterday, that he will govern for the entire Brazil, not only for those who vote for him, he will need to translate that in actions now, because that will be seen as the biggest challenge, I think, to prove that, first of all, he's not a corrupt. His accusations were not justifiable, and he can manage the country better. He can return what he has been 20 years ago when he was first coming to the presidency of Brazil.
Mm-hmm. Guilherme, the inauguration would have been totally different, the semantics absolutely different had Jair Bolsonaro been there for the passing of the sash. A symbolic move which always, from a Brazilian perspective, means the peaceful transition of power in a country that has been beset by decades and decades of dictatorship. Is this something that will overshadow the rule of Lula in the future?
No, much to the contrary. I think that it really taints Bolsonaro's image as somebody who's not fully committed to the democratic principles of Brazil. Bolsonaro fled the country a couple of days before Lula's inauguration. He had already said he wouldn't pass the sash to Lula, which in itself is the rupture with the democratic protocols. And the fact that he spent 2 months after losing the elections without saying a word and stimulating his supporters to keep protesting and camping in front of military headquarters, this in itself is a terrible sign for Bolsonaro if he wants to run for president again back in 2026. So I think that Lula he leaves the inauguration process stronger than he entered, because he received the sash from members of Brazil's civil society. So that was very symbolic, I think. And Lula managed a way to get around the absence of the former president. So that was a good thing. Unfortunately, Brazil doesn't have a tradition of presidents, elected presidents, passing the sash to other elected presidents. This has only happened once in 35 years. But still, I think it was a very symbolic moment that Lula could take the most of it.
Nizar, we're talking about Bolsonaro, who has refused to concede unequivocally. He remains a huge influence over his own supporters. Could this be enough to maintain the tension simmering in Brazil?
This is the big question. What will happen now with all his supporters? As one of the colleagues said previously, it is very unlikely that all those who voted for Bolsonaro were fervent supporters of Bolsonaro. But he has a strong number of supporters who will remain in the streets and who might get support from other sectors from Brazilian society. And whether Bolsonaro will be their leaders or not is the big question for the future. He remained silent for a couple of months. He left the country. He will be out of the country for a month at least. So this will very likely have an impact on his stature as a leader of the opposition. He didn't listen to all the political advisors who wanted him to address the people, to take the lead, to present himself as the leader of the future opposition. He did none of that. And he surprised us in the past, of course, and he managed to become president against the expectations of most everyone who was following the electoral process back in 2018 until August of 2018. But so he surprised us in the past very many times. He surprised his score in the elections, last year's elections, was also very surprising. Okay. So he might surprise us in the future. But for the time being, he lost some stature and he lost some influence over the voters who voted for him.
Vinicius, Lula said that there is no spirit of revenge. However, he made it clear that those who made mistakes would have to answer for those mistakes. Now, when you look at Bolsonaro, he's linked to 5 separate inquiries. Is it an indication that he's likely to be prosecuted in the near future? Just a matter of time?
I believe it is. We should remember as well that yesterday during the inauguration, one sound that came from the crowds was shouting, "No amnesty, no amnesty," meaning exactly that the population that support Lula as well, they want some responses about what happened in Brazil in these last 4 years. So Bolsonaro has no sort of immunity that he had before as MP in Brazil. He's now needs to respond in the common common justice. So I believe that very, very soon after the inauguration, that's this week already, maybe Bolsonaro will start to face some sort of inquiries from the justice. We should remember as well that one of the first actions of Lula in his government today was, or yesterday even, was to suspend all the secrecy that Bolsonaro established over some of his decisions, secrecies of 100 years. So what we will probably see is some sort of inquiry and probably some sort of prosecution against Bolsonaro in the coming months or years.
Let's try to unpack what happens next for Brazil. Guilherme, now, Lula made it clear that he will undo all of the legacy of Bolsonaro. Let's take step-by-step analysis of what happens next. When it comes to the deforestation of the Amazon, what is he likely to do here?
Well, I think that there are two paths that Lula is very likely to follow right now. The first path is international. Lula has traveled to the COP27 meeting in Cairo, in Sharm el-Sheikh, in Egypt 2 months ago. So that was a clear demonstration that Lula will return to Brazil's previous commitments on climate change and on the environment. Commitments that Brazil and that the Bolsonaro administration has basically destroyed over the last 4 years. And the second path is domestic. One of the things that we saw under Bolsonaro was the dismantling of pretty much every single environment protection agency, the regulatory agencies, the environmental legislations. They have been destroyed by Bolsonaro, and Lula will probably reinstate this firm legislation on the environment. Of course, it's going to make many people, many organized groups very upset, especially those predatory groups in the Amazon and organized crime and other sets of groups. But I think it's very important to demonstrate domestic commitment to the environment. And of course, it's going to bring many farmers and many people involved with the Amazon to his coalition by offering them sustainable alternatives that Bolsonaro has simply disregarded. So I think Lula has a very positive track record on environmental protection. If we look back into the early 2000s, Lula was responsible for the greatest reduction in forest clearing in the Amazon over his time in office. So I think it's challenging, but of course Lula is up to this challenge.
Nizar, he was very emotional when he was talking about poverty in his country. But how can the man and the political party, the Worker Party, that has been tainted by corruption charges, he's been in power for 13 years until the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, how can the party and the president reach out to the people, convince them that they are genuine about the need to clamp down on poverty?
Well, this has been a very long-standing commitment of Lula. The first time he reached power back in 2002, he spoke about hunger. And this time he's speaking about inequality. So I think that these are very strong messages for him as an individual, as a person who migrated from Pernambuco to São Paulo and who went through very difficult personal times, and then who was a union leader. So all of this speaks to him in a very personal way. And so this is a commitment of the party that is very important. So I think that as someone also said previously here, people will believe in deeds, not say what he's saying, but he will need to translate these words into deeds. But he started already doing that by negotiating this transition and remaining with the 600 reals support to the poorest people in the Brazilian population. So he made that a priority even before he became effectively president, which shows his commitment to the poorest people in the country.
Vinicius, could he replicate the same achievement of 2003 when Brazil came out strong economically with an unprecedented economic growth?
Well, Lula is taking Brazil in a world that's not the same world that he had in 2003. So the economic crisis today that affects the entire planet, it's touching very hardly in Brazil as well. So we need to take that into consideration. Lula is not returning to the Brazil that he had 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. So the challenges are much bigger now than it has been in the past. And even in aspects like environment, if you allow me to return to this point, mm-hmm. I think it's very important to remember as well that at the same time, 20 years ago, Marina Silva was the Minister of Environment, and she left a few months after the beginning of the government because of disagreement with what has been really acting as policies towards the environment in that first Lula's government. So Lula will have now as well to prove that his government will be not the same as it has been 20 years ago, because there was also some negative aspects that happened in that time in environmental terms as well. It's the period that Brazil built the Belo Monte Dam that had a huge impact environmentally to the region of the Amazonia in Brazil. Mm-hmm. So I think those aspects need to be taken into consideration. The world is not the same one, and we hope that Lula will not try to repeat the government he did 20 years ago, especially correcting the wrongdoings or at least the mistakes that has been made 20 years ago.
Guilherme, the fact that there is a leftist wave now in Latin America with 6 of the region's 7 largest countries electing leftist leaders since 2018, could this be good news for Lula?
Well, I think so. I think it's a window of opportunity. Let me just pick up on what Vinicius has just said. I think that because the world is different and because Brazil is not the same as the one of 20 years ago, Brazil is no longer an emerging country as it used to be. I think that the focus of Brazil's foreign policy will be pretty much on the region. So Lula will have to revitalize regional integration mechanisms such as Mercosur and UNASUR. Brazil abandoned UNASUR back in 2019. So I think it's high time for Brazil to revamp these regional region integration institutions. And of course, one of the greatest challenges regarding South America is to overcome Venezuela's humanitarian, political, and economic crisis. So in order to bring South America back again, and in order to use this pink tide that has swept across South America positively, Lula will have to address the Venezuelan crisis, and that must be his regional priority number 1.
And Nizar, briefly, if you don't mind, he will have to revoke Bolsonaro. He's revoking Bolsonaro's gun laws immediately. He will have to tackle education and health, particularly when it comes to health. We know what happened in the past with 700,000 people who lost their lives to COVID-19, and people said that was one of the biggest mistakes of the Bolsonaro government. Is it going to be an easy ride for Lula?
It won't be easy from no point of view, from the domestic point of view, from the international point of view, from the economic point of view, from the governing point of view. It won't be an easy task, but I think that Lula is up to the challenge. He managed to build a very strong coalition. He managed to bring very smart people to his government, his Minister of Health, his Minister of Education. All of these individuals have a long experience and have shown that they know what they're speaking about. So his team is a top-notch team, and he has the wiseness and the history and the background that will allow him to work with his vice president in order to negotiate the different deals that will allow Brazil to go through these very hard times.
And time will tell us if Lula will be able to deliver on the promises that he made. Vinicius, Mariano de Carvalho, Nizar, Messari, Guilherme, Casaroes, I really appreciate your insight. Thank you. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.